Picture the scene. A large troop build-up on Ukraine's northern border. Warnings from intelligence agencies that an attack might be imminent. Disbelief from analysts who are all too aware that the forces assembled for the invasion are too small to be up to the task. No, this is not a retro report we're filing from early 2022 on the eve of Russia's full-scale invasion. Instead, it's a snapshot of how things look at the end of summer 2024. Only this time, it's not Russia that's building its forces up on the borders of Ukraine, but Belarus. A nominally independent state, Belarus has, in effect, been a vassal for Vladimir Putin's ambitions ever since Moscow propped up its leader, Alexander Lukashenko, in the face of mass protests following a rigged election in 2020. Since then, Putin has made good use of his puppet. It was from southern Belarus that tens of thousands of Russian troops launched their attack on Kiev in the opening weeks of the conflict. From Belarus, that Moscow has sourced equipment to replace its damaged vehicles. And it was on Belarusian soil that Wagner fighters were temporarily housed following their aborted mutiny in 2023. Yet for all Lukashenko has facilitated Russia's war on Ukraine, he has so far stopped short of actually joining it. Hence why the news last week was so unexpected. On Sunday, August the 25th, Ukraine's foreign ministry raised the alarm about suspicious troop movements in Belarus's south. Under the guise of exercises, the ministry claimed that Minsk was concentrating a significant number of personnel who, it was implied, might constitute an invasion force. In part, these fears were due to the location of the troops just outside the city of Gomel. A mere 30 kilometers from Ukrainian territory, Gomel was one of the places Russian troops used in 2022 as a launch pad for their invasion. As such, any build-up there is worrying. As for the nature of the current build-up, well, there's some debate over its true extent. Earlier in August, Lukashenko went on TV to claim that he was sending a third of his armed forces to the border. However, independent monitoring group Belaruski Hajun estimates that the true number of troops deployed may be as low as 1,100. Small deployment or not, though, the troops involved are at least well armed. The Kiev Independent reports the presence of both special forces and former Wagner fighters, plus, quote, tanks, artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS, air defense systems, and engineering equipment. At the same time, analysis group Front Intelligence Insight has observed a concurrent buildup of Russian troops in the eastern part of Bryansk Oblast, a region of Russia that borders both northern Ukraine and Gomel Oblast in Belarus. As the group's founder remarked on X, the simultaneous Russian buildup, quote, definitely adds an uncomfortable dimension to the situation. So far, the actual purpose of all of this activity remains murky. Belarus has insisted that it is just conducting training exercises while also claiming that it's forestalling a planned Ukrainian attack on its territory. Exercises or not, though, Kiev's reaction couldn't have been clearer. In a widely published statement, Ukraine told Belarus not to make tragic mistakes and cease unfriendly actions before warning, in case of a violation of Ukraine's state border by Belarus, our state will take all necessary measures to exercise the right to self-defense. All troop concentrations, military facilities, and supply routes in Belarus will become legitimate targets for the armed forces of Ukraine. Given that Ukraine's military is now the most battle-tested in Europe, that warning shouldn't be taken lightly. But it also points towards a serious question. Why is Belarus threatening its southern neighbor? After all, if a fight were to break out between Kiev and Minsk, there's a ton of evidence that things would end very, very badly for Lukashenko. To see why, we simply need to look at the structure of the dictator's army. Back in February, analysis groups Front Intelligence Insight and Roshan Consulting collaborated on a deep dive into the Belarusian military's preparedness for war. They concluded that, quoting here, combat units are typically manned at only 30 to 40% capacity, relying heavily on mobilization. Now, there's nothing wrong with the mobilization approach to your armed forces per se, but it does mean that Minsk would have to start drafting men far ahead of any potential attack on Ukraine. Since no such mobilization has been detected, any invasion would have to be carried out by formations that are not only understaffed, but also under-equipped. On a thread on X, Konrad Musiker of Roshan Consulting recently outlined how the Belarusian military is reliant on old equipment from the last days of the USSR. Sending those units across the border into a high-tech war could likely spell disaster. This is especially true when you consider how the border currently looks. After Russian troops swept across the frontier back in 2022, Ukraine focused on mining and fortifying its far north. To quote Musiker, any attack from Belarus would therefore require an overwhelming amount of force to succeed. Minsk currently does not have the capability to muster such a force. Yet even if Lukashenko had an enormous supply of well-equipped troops, it's not entirely certain that he'd be able to stage an invasion of his neighbor. The main problem being that his officers might well refuse any orders to attack. That is the opinion of the Atlantic Council, which reports on signs that the Belarusian military is deeply reluctant to become engaged in the war. As they write, quoting here, "If Lukashenko attempts to force them, there is a reasonable chance he will not be obeyed. Such a standoff between the dictator and his military would of course be deeply destabilizing to the regime. The Institute for the Study of War assesses that the idea of joining the war is incredibly unpopular in Belarusian society. With presidential elections scheduled for February of 2025, Lukashenko would have to be as mad as a box of frogs to crank up the discontent and set the stage for a repeat of the protests that gripped the country in 2020. The final thing that suggests an invasion is unlikely is the issue of Putin's own calculations. While it might seem obvious that the autocrat will want Belarus to join the war, Matthew Balegi of Chatham House disagrees. Speaking to Al Jazeera, the consulting fellow remarked, "Lukashenko's regime is a complete vassal state to the Kremlin, but it is more valuable for Russia to keep it as a launchpad for military operations than to engulf it into the war." Now, the too long didn't read version then is that there are tons of good reasons to assume this military buildup won't become an invasion, all of which raises an obvious question. If Lukashenko is unlikely to invade, why send troops to the Ukrainian border at all? The first thing to note is that Minsk has done this before. In late 2022 and early 2023, Belarusian troops began massing near Ukraine, looking for all the world like they were about to open a new front north of Kyiv. Ultimately, the attack never came. And that may well have been the point. According to the ISW, quoting here, "These efforts served primarily to stretch Ukrainian forces along the theater of war and disrupt their operations." By massing troops near Ukraine, Lukashenko was able to force Kyiv to divert much-needed manpower and weaponry to its northern frontier. And what worked in early 2023 may well work again in the summer of 2024. Right now, Ukraine's forces are stretched perilously thin. A lack of manpower and a diversion of resources to defend Kharkiv and attack Kursk has left critical fronts like that around the Donbas city of Pokrovsk with undermanned defenses. If yet more troops have to be diverted to protect the northern border, it's going to badly affect operations on other parts of the front. This may be why both the ISW and Atlantic Council believe the troop buildup is little more than a fixing action. An example of Lukashenko creeping right up to the line that would provoke a Ukrainian response without quite crossing it. Luckily, Kyiv so far seems to be wise to his plans. At the time of writing on Thursday, there are no signs that Ukrainian troops are being withdrawn from Kursk or Pokrovsk to defend the north. Lukashenko's gamble appears to have failed. However, this assumes that a fixing action is all it ever was, because while a Belarusian attack on Ukraine would be self-defeating, we can't completely rule it out. As analyst Katsiana Shmatsina recently noted on X, the Lukashenko regime may be feeling overconfident right now. As she points out, recent military exercises with China, plus the presence of Russian tactical nukes on Belarusian soil, may have led them to feel emboldened. Such overconfidence might have real-world impacts. Although he assesses the possibility as low, Konrad Muska has written that he cannot entirely rule out a scenario whereby Belarusian forces conduct small-scale incursions to seize pockets of Ukrainian territory. In other words, a run at Kyiv may be off the cards, but a scenario where Lukashenko's soldiers attack and occupy Ukrainian border villages cannot be dismissed. If that does happen, we'll be hurled into a strange new phase of the war, one in which Kyiv will be faced with major choices about how to respond. The first about whether to redeploy troops from other sectors to defeat the incursion, and the second about whether to strike targets on Belarusian territory. Again, we should stress that this outcome is unlikely. More likely is that Putin is simply hoping the sight of a troop buildup will scare the Ukrainians into pulling much-needed men off the Donbas or Kursk fronts. As with everything in this war, though, it's hard to predict with any certainty where things might go. Invading Ukraine would likely mean the end of Lukashenko, but that doesn't mean Putin might not pressure the dictator into trying it. And now we turn our attention to Argentina. If you haven't heard much about Argentina recently, it's likely because of the economic shock therapy President Javier Milei is putting the country through. After decades of overspending and brutally high inflation, the chainsaw-wielding showman has implemented severe austerity to try and get the economy back on track, slashing entire government departments in a quest to bring down spending. Yet if recent reporting is to be believed, there is one organization on the payroll that's about to get a fiscal boost, one place where money will still flow even in this age of book balancing: the Argentine military. According to The Economist, Milei has vowed to hike defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2032, a boost that would make Buenos Aires one of the biggest defense spenders in the whole of South America. And not only that, but the president has also vowed to make the military a high-tech force. In April, the government closed a deal to buy 24 of Denmark's used F-16 fighter jets for $300 million. Shortly after, Breaking Defense reported on another deal to buy Basler BT-67 aircraft prop planes for $143 million, while Buenos Aires is apparently apparently in talks to purchase Stryker armored fighting vehicles. All in all then, it looks like boom time for Argentina's military. Yet one key question remains. Why? Right now, Argentina is on relatively good terms with all of its neighbors. While gangs are an increasing problem, they're nowhere near the level that would require an Ecuador-style military response. Even on the issue of the Falkland Islands, known in Argentina as Las Malvinas, Milei has told the BBC he prefers a diplomatic solution over a costly war. Given all that then, it's reasonable to ask why the president is investing so heavily in defense at a time when the country has arguably never seemed safer. As is often the case, there's no single answer. Instead, Argentina's pivot de largesse towards its military appears to be inspired by a combination of factors, some common sense, some geopolitical. In the common sense corner, perhaps the salient fact is that the military really just needs the money. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Buenos Aires currently spends less on its military as a share of gross domestic product than any other nation in South America. In 2023, the government assigned a measly 0.47% of GDP to defense spending, less than even Guyana, a country that barely has a functioning army. Of course, Argentina is a vastly bigger economy than Guyana, so the actual amount in dollar terms is still over $2 billion. Yet, as The Economist points out, 90% of that $2 billion was used to pay salaries and pensions. In terms of actual investment in new kits, or hell, even the maintenance of the kit they already have, the Argentines are spending almost nothing. The worst part? This is a trend that's been ongoing since 2004. As a result, the armed forces are arguably no longer functional. This was the conclusion of the UK Defence Journal in 2018, when it declared that, quoting here, after a significant period of decline, Argentina has ceased to be a capable military force. The article highlighted the fact that the Air Force had grounded almost all of its planes due to poor maintenance, while the Navy's 4 destroyers were being forced to operate without any serviceable weaponry. Ground Forces kit dated back to the 1970s, and even then it was in short supply. So bad was the state of the military that former Defense Minister Julio Martinez claimed that the Air Force had lost more planes to poor maintenance than had been lost in the Falklands War. It wasn't always like this, though. At the end of the 1970s, Buenos Aires was spending over 4.6% of GDP on defense. While this number dropped off after the fall of the military junta in 1983, defense spending remained at semi-decent levels right up to the end of the 1990s. You can see this just by looking at some of the operations the Argentine military undertook in this era. During the Gulf War, Buenos Aires sent 4 destroyers and 2 helicopters to help the Allies. When Yugoslavia imploded, Argentine troops were among the stabilization force sent to Bosnia. But then came the economic crisis of the early 2000s, and the era of defense investment was killed off, seemingly forever. If you need a hand in grasping just how deep the country's fiscal problems were in 2001 to 2002, you could do worse than look up Wikipedia's entry on the topic, which calls it the Argentine Great Depression. Amid economic catastrophe, keeping the military funded began to slip down the list of priorities. By 2004, a new, more left-wing government had lowered defense spending below 1% of GDP. It would never again rise above that limit. So, yeah, you can maybe see why it might be time to give the military some financial backing. But practical requirements are not the only reason Milei is investing in the armed forces. There's also a sharp geopolitical angle. Back when we listed some of Argentina's recent military purchases, you may have noticed one salient fact. All the proposed kit, from F-16s to Stryker armored vehicles, is to be built in or bought from NATO countries. And that is not an accident. At the time Buenos Aires sealed the deal with Denmark for its old F-16s, it was supposed to be buying fighter jets from China, an agreement that Milei scrapped. Months earlier, the president halted Argentina's planned accession to the expanded BRICS group, now dominated by Beijing and Moscow. More recently, he's asked for his nation to be officially designated a global partner of NATO. This is a serious reorientation of Argentinian foreign policy. As the Wilson Center points out, NATO currently has a single global partner in Latin America, and that's Colombia. By boosting his nation's economic and political ties to NATO, Milei appears to be sending a strong signal to Washington, a signal that, as the world divides into competing blocs headed by America and China, Buenos Aires wants to be on Uncle Sam's side. As the National Interest writes, regarding the logic behind the shift, quote, "For Argentina, this move strengthens its strategic ties with the United States, diminishes the strategic risk of being perceived as a Chinese proxy in the South Atlantic." And the key word in that sentence may be perceived. For all Milei might be making the right noises about a Western tilt, The truth is that Argentina would find it extremely hard to fully align with Washington against China. Beijing is Buenos Aires' single biggest export market after Brazil. In recent decades, China has invested heavily in everything from Argentine lithium mines to nuclear power. In America, the talk is of decoupling from China. In Europe, it is of de-risking. In Argentina, it is not clear Milei could do either of these things without triggering massive economic consequences. Investing in the military, then, might be intended more as a geopolitical signal, a way of undergoing necessary modernization, yes, but also of showing the West that Buenos Aires wants to be in its corner whilst forestalling any major Chinese backlash. Whatever the truth, the fact is that Milei's defense splurge could have profound long-term consequences. Consequences that could see Argentina become the third biggest defense investor in South America after only Colombia and Ecuador. For some in a nation that still remembers the scars of military rule, that may be a worrying sign. For Milei's supporters, though, it may be a sign that the flamboyant president is simply making Argentina great again. Next up, we travel to Libya, where in the wake of a long and brutal civil war, the fractured nation has staggered its way through a peace and reconstruction process. But according to international sources reporting from inside Libya, that fragile peace now shows signs of rapid deterioration. After months of rising tensions, a single flashpoint threatens to send the country careening back towards war. The flashpoint? Libya's central bank. No matter the nation we're talking about, affairs at the central bank are always going to be important. That's where the major financial decisions get made, the prime conduit for money to change hands both domestically and internationally, and the vault into which the wealth of a nation is often poured. But in Libya, the central bank takes on a whole other level of importance. That is because in all of Libya, it is the one and only internationally recognized bank that can receive and handle the incoming revenues of Libya's oil industry. Oil is Libya's main export, with its revenues from the combined export of crude and refined petroleum, along with petroleum gas, combining to make up about 94% of the entire export economy. And while that fact alone would already lead to significant pressure squeezing the sole financial institution that can handle that cash flow, Libya has another complicating factor to consider. Libya doesn't have one ruling government, it's got two, and they do not play nicely. Now, we won't be diving into a full history of the Libyan civil war in this installation of the Situation Room. If you'd like to see a deep dive, we've actually done an entire separate episode on the subject. And if we do say ourselves, it is a fantastic way to spend 39 minutes once you're finished here. But we do have to give the critical background that'll make today's story make sense. So here are the basics. Libya had two civil wars in the 2010s, the Muammar Gaddafi one and the other one. We're talking about the other one, which lasted for 6 years, turned into a horrible mess, and resulted in two governments each controlling major portions of Libya's territory. One of them is called the Government of National Unity. It's based in the Libyan capital and largest city of Tripoli. It's recognized by several Middle Eastern and South Asian governments, and as a result of its location, it controls the headquarters of the Central Bank of Libya. It's also very weak. So weak, in fact, that its own parliament actually just dissolved it about 2 weeks ago, and it represents but has little control over a whole bunch of warlords and elites that actually run that other half of the country. The other government is called the Government of National Stability, also run and empowered by a bunch of elites and warlords and based in the major city of Benghazi. Although the Government of National Stability is largely iced out of Tripoli and thus has a harder time accessing the central bank, it happens to control the vast majority of Libya's oil fields, meaning that it, not its rival, controls the means of production. For the purposes of clarity in today's episode, and not forcing either you or ourselves to keep track of who's the unity government and who's the stability government, we'll refer to them by the cities they're based in. The Tripoli government, which controls the central bank, and the Benghazi government, which controls the oil. You're welcome. The man at the heart of this current crisis is one Sadiq al-Kabir, the governor and head of the central bank. Broadly speaking, nobody likes Kabir. He's been head of the central bank for 13 years, including through the entire course of the 6-year civil war, and over the years, he's pissed off a lot of people. In particular, the groups that have now unified into the Benghazi government have wanted to get rid of him for years, and for a while they tried to create an alternative central bank that most of the world just ultimately ignored. Al-Kabir's decisions when managing Libya's oil wealth have been a subject of broad criticism on both sides of the country's dividing line. But now it's the Benghazi government that's demanding that al-Kabir be returned to his job after the Tripoli government has forced him out. The reasons for al-Kabir's ouster are a matter of internal Libyan politicking, but we can basically boil them down to his having angered Tripoli's prime minister, who wanted to spend a whole lot of money while al-Kabir was trying to do the opposite. The endless struggle over oil between Tripoli and Benghazi certainly isn't new, but in recent weeks, the dispute has turned deadly serious. A couple of weeks ago, armed men who were believed to be acting on behalf of the groups who prop up Tripoli government placed the central bank's headquarters under siege. They demanded that al-Kabir resign over objections from many of Libya's international partners, including the United States, who threatened that removing him by force would see Libya iced out of global finance as punishment. A week later, after the siege ended without violence, the head of the central bank's IT department, a man named Musab Musalem, was kidnapped by unidentified captors and held hostage. The central bank attested that other executives had been threatened with kidnapping, but this time the bank got at least relatively lucky. Musalem was released not long after. Soon after that, the prime minister in Tripoli would sack al-Kabir outright. But while all of this was already not a good situation, the events of the last week or so have proved that the state of affairs will only get worse. Over the last several days, reports have emerged within Libya of armed factions mobilizing, bringing an end to what had previously been several years where ex-soldiers or inactive fighters were back to going about their daily lives while Tripoli and Benghazi squabbled over fine details. The fighters who are taking up arms again include, to appear, sizable numbers of people who would be loyal to each opposing government. They join other rival groups already facing off in the northwest of the country and may take positions aligning with or opposing another major armed group under Khalifa Haftar's control, currently positioning in the southwest. And while the Benghazi government has been unable to take direct action in Tripoli by, say, breaking the siege around the central bank or giving al-Kabir physical protection, they announced on Monday, August the 26th, that they would take the boldest and most game-changing action available to them. On that day, the prime minister of the Benghazi government, Osama Hamad, announced that all oil fields, refining facilities, and terminals would be shut down effective immediately as a direct answer to the attacks on the leaders and employees of the central bank. As we've mentioned, the vast majority of Libya's oil fields and infrastructure are under the direct control of the Benghazi government, in areas where Tripoli's paramilitary forces couldn't reach even on their best day. Although he's been sitting back from the Benghazi government somewhat, the notorious warlord Khalifa Haftar and his forces still keep watch over Libya's east. And just for the record, it's Haftar, not Benghazi's official prime minister, who truly decides whether Libya's oil fields are shut down. In the immediate aftermath of the announcement, individual oil subsidiaries inside Libya announced a variety of different approaches to the order. Some saying they'd shut down entirely, others saying they'd scale back gradually, and others saying that they hadn't heard anything. But by 2 days later, August the 28th, more and more oil fields were shutting down at a pace that could see the entire national industry grind to a halt by this time next week. Now look, when it comes to geopolitics, there are a few idioms out there that are perhaps a little bit overused. Saying that something is spiraling out of control, or that Nation X and Nation Y are strange bedfellows, or that everybody's standing back and letting the dominoes fall, are often a well-placed rhetorical twist, but sometimes diverge a little bit from the, shall we say, ideal meaning of the phrase. But when it comes to one such idiom, in this case, kicking the hornet's nest, you don't get much closer to the ideal meaning than unilaterally shutting down the oil fields of Libya. Such an act isn't just an inconvenience for Libya in both its governments, but instead a threat to basic national survival. Shut down the oil fields, choke off production, and next to no money is coming into the country. That's not just a problem for the government that controls the oil fields, but also the government in Tripoli, where leaders and ordinary people still take their slice of the pie, even though the governments are at odds. It's a reasonable assumption that the Benghazi government could probably survive longer without that money, either because of stashes of wealth they might have prepared for such an eventuality, or because it's got options to make up for its losses elsewhere. Perhaps by selling to nations like Russia or Iran that are happy to spurn the global order. But shutting down the oil fields of Libya doesn't just make an armed showdown between East and West more likely. It makes such a showdown all but inevitable. In a situation where, for Tripoli, time is of the essence. Every day the Benghazi cuts off the oil it's another day that Tripoli gets closer to collapse. They've got to take back the oil fields ASAP, or the government might not survive long enough to carry out a better considered plan. The bank's central reserves certainly aren't nothing. They amount to about $27 billion US, but only a fraction of that could be spent on a war effort, even if Tripoli is able to access it for such purposes, which is no guarantee. Attempts to resolve the crisis have failed, at least in the early going. A replacement appointee to the central bank that Tripoli had offered eventually faced such pressure that he himself had to say he wouldn't take the position out of fears that people would fight and die over the move. To illustrate just how badly he ultimately didn't want the job, here's his own quote. "My professional and career history and my ethics absolutely do not allow me to be part of this chaos. By God, a single drop of our children's blood is more precious to me than all the spoils of the world and the jobs of the Libyan state. Oh God, I am innocent of what the oppressors are doing." The new deputy head of the bank has revealed additional problems, sharing with the world that Al-Kabir himself is in possession of secret codes that will be necessary for Tripoli to open the vaults. Right before he was sacked, Al-Kabir shared that militias had made additional threats and that 4 more staff members had been kidnapped, thus revealing that further non-compliance from the bank would likely lead to worse. But with Al-Kabir still holding the codes, it's not clear what the bank's new leaders can do to change anything. Tripoli's attempts to scold Benghazi have unsurprisingly fallen on deaf ears, while the results of direct meetings between the head of America's Military Africa Command and the warlord Khalifa Haftar directly are still unknown. Publicly, Tripoli shows no sign of backing down, probably banking on the international pressure that its backers, predominantly the United Nations, can bring to bear on Benghazi. But if they don't get those codes from Al-Kabir, they are in massive trouble. If they do get the codes, but do it by leaning on some of the most common tactics of a desperate government facing collapse, namely torture or other forms of severe coercion, then the UN support may not last very long. Already the news is rippling through global markets, with world oil prices starting to drop lower and lower as the Libya situation coincided with other concerning news from abroad. At this moment, it appears likely that the government in the east, Benghazi and their backer Haftar, will opt to continue their oil blockade for as long as it takes. But the group that will ultimately decide where this crisis goes will be the Western government in Tripoli, forced to decide whether it wants to slowly starve for wealth or take whatever decisive action it can to try and change the game. There are no guarantees that Tripoli will opt for peace. Perhaps they may believe Haftar is bluffing and will either back down or find his forces overrun if Tripoli's own warlords decide to move against him. But one among the most valuable lessons of the Libyan civil war was that calling Khalifa Haftar's bluff tends to be a very bad idea. Tripoli and Benghazi have long been running low on rationale and patience to work with each other, and now they may finally have given each other an excuse to let the bullets fly. And from Libya, we head eastward to Indonesia, where a constitutional crisis last week precipitated a stunning wave of protests, and where, in the aftermath, the previously uneventful handoff of Indonesia's government has now adopted much higher stakes. The protests came in the Indonesian capital city of Jakarta and in other major cities across the nation as the Indonesian parliament met on Thursday, August 22nd, to ratify a series of changes to Indonesia's election law. The changes, in short, accomplished a few key tasks. They made it so that all regional governors in Indonesia would have to be age 30 only at the time of inauguration, rather than as previously established at the time of election, and they reversed a rule change that would have allowed small political parties to field candidates for regional office. The changes are innocuous enough, until you realize why exactly that change in minimum electable age for local government is so important. It directly serves one Kaesang Pangarep, aged 29, who would be 1 month shy of his 30th birthday on the date of the coming gubernatorial elections, November the 27th, in the capital district of Jakarta. So, is young Kaesang a political wunderkind whose forced absence from this year's elections would do the people of Jakarta some great disservice? Unfortunately, no. He's the son of soon-to-be former President Joko Widodo. Making matters worse, he's not even the only Widodo child to be a beneficiary of lowered age thresholds this cycle. Widodo's eldest son, Gibran Raka, is 36 years old and is currently the vice president-elect for a position that previously could only be granted to Indonesians age 40 or older. Now, as previously stated, Indonesia is in a moment of political transition, with the outgoing president, 10-year incumbent Widodo, in the process of handing over the reins to his successor, former military leader Prabowo Subianto. Indonesia's February elections were not without their controversies. Subianto is unpopular in much of Indonesia and has long been accused of a range of human rights abuses, including torture and enforced disappearances, while the legitimacy of the 2024 election has also been called into question. But after some frustration was voiced by the Indonesian public and legal system in the aftermath, Subianto, now rebranded into a sort of fun grandpa figure in the Indonesian press, has broadly been accepted, if maybe a little begrudgingly. The transition is supposed to be less a real change in Indonesia and more of a handoff. Widodo and Subianto share a long history as part of the old authoritarian regime, and Widodo's adult son, Gibran, will be vice president. And in a nation long accustomed to repression, watching one former stooge of the old regime hand over power to another, a public protest is a risky business, especially when the Widodo government has already taken steps to constrain protest activity online. But alongside the keen awareness of Indonesians that protest is becoming more and more difficult is an awareness that if the people are going to choose a time to protest anyway, then they better make the most of it. And if the events of this year will one day become an Indonesian hit film entitled Election 2024, Rise of the Nepo Babies, then the people of Indonesia just provided a hell of a plot twist. As Parliament met in Jakarta to enshrine the new rule that would see Widodo's younger son made governor, tens of thousands of people gathered outside the Parliament building, hell-bent on preventing yet another Widodo overreach that seemed to finally be a bridge too far. Outside the building, protesters tried to tear down the Parliament gates, others set fires in the streets, and others endured tear gas and water cannons as they clashed with local law enforcement. Online, angry people broke a long-held taboo and dredged up Widodo's old birth name that, as part of an old Javanese ritual, his family had changed in order to help leave a long childhood sickness behind. Protesters fought back by throwing rocks, they waved banners and shouted slogans on national television, and some even wheeled in an effigy of Widodo accompanied by a mock guillotine. When Parliament attempted to halfway capitulate, promising that the new changes wouldn't go into effect until after the presidential transition, it just wasn't enough. Eventually, the Parliament meeting was called off for the day without a revolution, in a resounding but temporary victory for the protest movement. So beyond a simple act of one-time nepotism, the changes that the Widodo government are trying to enact would represent the most brazen step in a process that the Indonesian public have watched slowly play out for years. Slow, incremental changes designed to entrench the Widodo family and its political allies in office and ice out all the many parts of civil society that could otherwise try and challenge them. Widodo's third son would be elected to the Jakarta governorship and kickstart his political career while ensuring the stability of his father's power base, but it'd also beat a prominent government critic who the ruling party fears would challenge for the same seat. The decision to bar political parties from fielding candidates for election if they hold less than 20% of seats in the regional government would mean that many members of Widodo's own party would run unopposed because, in so many places, nobody other than the ruling party has over 20% of seats. It doesn't take a Machiavellian mastermind to see the intent here. Widodo wants to ensure Indonesia's long-term political loyalty to his party before he leaves office, and he'd like his own family members to play a central role, if at all possible. But the rage that erupted out at Widodo and his government appears to have put a stop to the changes, at least for now. In the immediate aftermath of the protests, with concerns growing that the situation would become a full-blown constitutional crisis, the Parliament announced that its planned changes would be shelved until a later date. It also backed off its attempts to bar smaller parties from elections, allowing a return to the easier-to-meet thresholds that had seen that opposition candidate in Jakarta enabled to run. As of now, it appears that there will be no changes to the current pre-protest rules governing this year's elections, and the younger of Widodo's sons, the one vying for Jakarta's governorship, will ultimately not take part this time around. Probably not helping matters at home, he and his beauty queen wife have been enjoying a lavish vacation in America and posting it online all through the week, raising the already boiling blood of ordinary Indonesians just a little bit more. Those Instagram posts have already been scrubbed, but we checked. And further from the public eye, Indonesian legal debate now centers around the question of which branch of government gets to determine election rules, starting a long saga that could still lead to the constitutional crisis that Widodo and his successor so fear. As for whether this explosion of popular discontent will become something more, well, it's difficult to say. Outgoing President Widodo enjoys high personal approval ratings, or at least he did prior to this whole crisis, and it's not clear that there's enough public animus against Prabowo Subianto to either carry on these protests or make it metastasize if the government doesn't do anything else to stir up anger. But for the world's third largest democracy, now looking less and less like a democracy every year, we've still got to emphasize that Jakarta appears to have found its breaking point. point. Like we mentioned previously, it is rare for protests of this size to break out in Indonesia, but now that genie is out of the bottle, and if incoming President Subianto intended to ride into office on the back of such a controversial election and change the country's governance as he saw fit, then he's likely to be disappointed by the reactions he gets. That possibility is made all the more real by some of Prabowo's old campaign promises, including his long-held desire to return Indonesia to its 1945 constitution, thus stripping away most democratic reforms and eliminating direct presidential elections entirely. Now, on this channel, we often cover regimes that seem one step away from popular revolt, and we should be clear, Indonesia isn't that, and certainly not right now, but it's also clear that the outgoing Widodo government and its successors are moving Indonesia back on a path toward authoritarianism, and it's now clear that the people of Indonesia aren't about to come along quietly. How Widodo and Subianto react now will tell us a lot, but they're at a crossroads either way. They can start the crackdowns, broaden their restrictions on freedom of assembly and speech, react to protest with more extreme use of force, and start marching down the path toward authoritarianism again. Or they can read the room, step back in their ambitions, and either maintain the status quo or take steps to bring the government back in line with what its people expect. Only they can decide what comes next, but the people of Indonesia have just been reminded of a truth that Widodo seems to have wanted them to forget, that when a proper democracy speaks, Widodo, and now Subianto must listen, not the other way around.